I'm terrible at pimping my stuff, so I thought dressing like a pimp might make it a little bit easier. I have blogs where you can read stuff and see things and interact with me. My main one is postmortemstudios.wordpress.com. My writing one and sort of diary blog is over at talesofgrim.wordpress.com. Hope to see you there. Apparently some of you felt that I baited and switched you with the last video about maps, and you were genuinely interested in my opinion on maps as it relates to role-playing gaming. I can only apologise and say that it's all really down to the YouTube algorithm and certain naughty no-no words and so on, and so I had to be somewhat diplomatic and somewhat obtuse putting together that video to have any hope of it being searchable, findable, and being monetized. As it was demonetized due to a rather dubious copyright strike, but that's as maybe. So, okay, fine, fair enough. I'll give you my opinion on fantasy maps. Gamers have long had a fascination with fantasy maps. I think that somewhat goes back to the original dungeoneering days, where knowing where you'd been, what you'd seen, and the quickest way out was, genuinely useful for survival. But I also think a lot of it more generally applies to people who are into the fantasy genre in particular, slightly more than science fiction. It makes the world more concrete. It helps you imagine it. It makes you think of a far-off, mysterious place, and it just somehow helps suspend your disbelief to see a map and to understand how one place relates to another. One of the greatest maps in the fantasy genre, as far as I'm concerned, is the city of Ankh-Morpork, which feels like a real living city in the way that it's laid out, in the European style jumble of a mess that it's in, rather than the American grid system that we're perhaps more used to when it comes to modern cities. And the funny thing about that is Terry didn't set out with a particular idea of how the city was put together, where one thing was in relation to another. He had a vague sort of idea, but then people going through the books were able to piece it together so it made sense, and to produce a genuine feeling, realistic seeming map of Ankh-Morpork in this big magnificent jumble that reminds you of the older parts of places like Canterbury or Salisbury in the real world. And that's kind of how most cities are realistically put together, in a kind of jumble and making it up as you go along, really. So I think that's a big part of why that map in particular stands out to me. But I think this fascination with maps, even further back than Terry Pratchett, goes back to Tolkien. I mean, the map of Middle Earth is a definitive, recognisable fantasy landscape that appears to make sense geographically and in all these other ways. And I think it's through reading that and getting lost in the deep lore behind the Lord of the Rings, I think that's where gamers really pick up this love of maps from. I mean, gamers love maps so much that there is a whole style of play, hex-crawl, which comes down to maps, because one of the types of map that you can have is a hex map, where it's divided up into a hexagonal grid. So you can gauge the distances, and usually it's something like a day's foot travel or something. So you can see your characters making progress on the map, mapping the area as they go along, discovering things. And that has a huge appeal to a lot of people, I think. More recently, of course, there's Westeros, which lots of people are very familiar with now. But if you go back in gaming, the nostalgia value of a good map is enormous. You show certain kinds of gamers this kind of a blueprint, old-style TSR map, and their hearts get all aflutter. Or you show another type of gamer the hex grid of the Spinwood Marches, and at the time somewhat scientifically accurate map of part of the galaxy. And they get all excited and teary-eyed and nostalgic. These are fantasy landscapes that we have explored, that we have gone across, that we have lived in. For me, the gaming map that has the most emotional impact, I think, is the big map of Rokugan from Legend of the Five Rings. I forget which edition, maybe second. It was a big map. I had it laminated. I'm not sure where I've put it, otherwise I'd show you the actual map. But we had a very long, very emotional, very impactful, very fun game set in Rokugan. And so much of our time was spent galloping north and south through the lands on horses throughout the whole thing. I feel like a part of that fantasy landscape, perhaps more than any other. So what is the appeal of this map? What's the psychology behind it? Why are they so impactful and meaningful to us? I think a fantasy map, or filling out a fantasy map by moving through it, making associations, remembering people and places and things, I think it appeals to a sense of exploration and wanderlust that many of us have. And the real world is, by and large, with a few notable and extreme exceptions, mapped and understood, and we know what's what and what's where, and even if we don't, it's only a Google search away, and you can find a map and you can zoom in as if you're in some high-tech thriller from the 90s to see individual houses, and even drop down to the street and see people, albeit with their faces blurred. There's not a great deal of real, genuine mystery or terra incognita left in the real world. So the fantasy worlds that we turn to explore, they have a special kind of thrill, and they appeal to that unfulfilled desire that we have to strike out and find somewhere new. And like I mentioned, that emotional mapping, I think, is important. When we roleplay and we adventure within a world, and when it has a map, and when the people and the politics and the geography all make sense and come together, then it's a lot easier to inhabit that world, even if your travel is just tossed aside with a sentence or two, like you ride south for 2 days. If you look at the map and you can see where you've moved on the map, how you've got from one place to another, the things you've passed and so on, it helps ground it. And if you think about how we think about the real world around us, we don't map the world in a purely mechanical manner. Like, it's this number of miles to here, this number of miles to there. We name things, we name places. They have emotional resonance, either generally through the architecture or the nature of the place it is, or personally. Different places can mean different things to us. I've lived in this same village the vast and overwhelming majority of my life, despite various attempts to escape, and a bit like Scarfolk in that way. So everywhere here has emotional resonance and memories and people and events attached to it, and that makes me feel like part of the landscape here. And I think when it comes to fantasy gaming, when you do things, when you do a heroic deed in such and such a village, but you see how that village relates to the town, and that town relates to the city, and that's the forest we travelled through to get to the cave of the blah blah blah. It just brings you into it. I think it sucks you in and makes the world feel more real, particularly if you're genuinely exploring and discovering and uncovering things in the world as you go. Yeah, and maps used to be a matter of survival. Like I said, in more old school games, it was a good idea to know where you'd been and where you hadn't been. One player would typically be the dungeon mapper and would have a nice set of grid paper and would mark out the rooms and the areas and so on as you went, so that you would remember to go back and check the places you hadn't been in case you missed any loot or any experience points for any monsters, or just so you could flee in the most expedient manner possible afterwards. Hex crawls are that on a larger scale, where instead of exploring the dungeon room by room, you're exploring the map area by area and mapping it as you go, discovering things or heading towards that mountain on the horizon. Hex crawls are probably the earliest form of sort of free roaming gaming, even before that was a thing in computer games and so on. You could just plonk your characters down into the world. The map would have a whole series of associations and resources and wandering monsters and whatever else that you could situate your quests, your adventures, whatever in, or you could just meander about and do stuff as it came up, as your games master came up with things. And that's hugely appealing in its own way to a lot of people, more so perhaps than a dungeon, which is basically fantasy SWAT team clearing a building quite often, unfortunately. Now, there's one area of fantasy maps that I haven't touched on or talked about yet, and that's battle maps. I've never really been a fan. And when I first started gaming, I had the old Middle Earth role-playing box set, which came with some black and white fold-out maps and a lot of standee figures and so on. It was a very good, very cheap way to do it. So I started out with maps. But then once I realised that you didn't really need them, it was extremely liberating. It allows the world, the room, the terrain, whatever that you're playing in to be more elastic and gives you more free room as a games master. I don't mind maps in resources, so I can get a vague idea of how to describe things and how they relate one to another. But I do find maps constricting in a lot of ways. And I never have time to paint miniatures or to collect enough miniatures for whatever it is I do. And I never usually play a game long enough or have enough disposable money to get miniatures for it. I did go back to using maps recently over the last few years in a game of Iron Kingdoms that I was running. And that's a much more tactical game derived from the miniatures war game. So it worked there, but I still felt that maps and grids had a lot of shortcomings. They reduced a lot of options for me as a games master to do things and to describe things. And the maps are often quite static or extremely expensive. So you can end up using the same map over and over and over again, and it's too familiar. It's better when you have a map with elements that you can add or remove on top, trees, tables, whatever. I would love to be able to afford something like Dwarven Forge, but it's just too expensive and not justifiable for the kind of games that I typically run, unfortunately. So I like fantasy maps. I like dungeon maps to an extent. I love hex maps, and I love just maps of fantasy worlds in general, but battle maps, they just somehow don't really do it for me. Tactical play, reducing everything to mechanics and position, it's not how I like to play things. Now, if you want to make your own maps in your own fantasy worlds, I've got a quick handful of tips. The first one is the generic tip that I always give in any aspect of role-playing creativity, and that is, don't aim for realism, because unless you're an expert on every subject that comes up, you're never going to hit that mark. Aim for plausibility. Look at maps of the real world, see how geography seems to sort of interrelate, maybe pick an area of the world, turn it around, shift some of the elements about, but maintain the sort of the ecosystems and where are the big settlements, that sort of thing. Use that for inspiration. You don't have to stick to it exactly. It doesn't have to be exactly bang on what we know of geography, but if you aim for that plausibility, that's usually sufficient, and it will aid that suspension of disbelief I was talking about earlier. Whereas if you set up really jarring elements, it doesn't work so much, and it can throw people out, unless this is deliberate and it's a result of magic or something. But then those sorts of areas are the exception rather than the rule. It's like I always say, a lot of people will say you need to override certain elements and expectations within a fantasy world, particularly if you're playing a historical fantasy game, when it comes to gender roles or race relations or whatever else it might be. But you have to get the grounding right, or the fantasy elements don't work. If you get the feudal system right and add dragons, that can work. But you have to get the feudal system right that underlies it, the politics in the world, the human interactions, the things that we're more sensitized to. You have to get those right before you bring in the magic, the dragons, the flying mountains, all of that sort of thing. And it'll work so much better if you do it that way. And adventurers are always the exception, and magic is always the exception, so that's what allows you to break the rules. I hope this was enlightening and makes up for yesterday's video. Zang. It's been called misogynistic, racist, a hate group, reactionary. It's been blamed for Trump, for keeping women out of games and technology. None of this is true. If you want the real story, then you need to buy Inside Gamergate.